Bound and guarded by armed outlaws in the Arizona desert, Nayeli never once begged for mercy. What Wesley Calder did next changed his life forever, though neither of them yet understood how much. This was Arizona territory in the spring of 1884, in a stretch of country where the mountains stood blue and far off in the morning and closed and black by dusk, and where a town known as Piñon Wells had grown up around a good spring and a bad reputation for looking the other way when trouble came through. Wesley Calder ran a modest cattle spread in Cottonwood Valley, land his father had scratched a living out of for 20 years before a fall from a green horse ended him on a cold October morning, and Wesley had spent the 6 years since proving, mostly to himself, that he could keep the place standing without anyone's help. He was 31 that spring, unmarried, broad-shouldered in the plain way of a man who did his own fence work rather than hire it out, and known around the county less for anything he claimed about himself than for the simple fact that he judged a person, settler or Apache, man or woman, by what they did with their hands and their word, not by where they had been born or what they wore into town. It was not always a popular way to think in that part of the territory. More than one neighbor had raised an eyebrow at how easily Wesley traded with the Chiricahua families who came down out of the foothills each spring for salt and cloth, treating them no differently than he treated the cattle buyers up from Tucson, and Wesley had lost a friendship or two over exactly that habit. He had never once found a reason to change his mind about it, and nothing that happened that spring gave him one. He rode into Piñon Wells that particular morning for nothing more exciting than flour, nails, and a length of new rope, a supply run he made every few weeks without much thought, and he might have finished it in an hour and ridden home none the wiser about anything if the street outside the old Bell & Sons warehouse hadn't been choked with a crowd he didn't like the look of. Wesley had seen plenty of crowds in his life, church crowds, cattle auction crowds, the kind that gathered for a hanging when the circuit judge finally came through, and he knew inside of 10 seconds that this one belonged to none of those categories. People stood in a loose, frightened knot at a careful distance from the warehouse doors, their voices low and their hands wringing, and nobody in that knot was doing a single thing to help whoever was inside. A boy no older than 10 stood near the front of the crowd, clutching his mother's skirt, and it was the sight of that boy's pale, frozen face more than anything else that made Wesley tie off his horse right there instead of riding on toward the mercantile the way good sense might otherwise have argued for. He tied his horse and pushed through until he could see past the doorway into the gloom, and what he found there stopped him cold. A gang of 6 or 7 armed men had taken the warehouse over sometime in the last 2 days, and inside it they were holding better than a dozen travelers and townsfolk they'd swept up during a string of raids along the stage road, holding them for ransom, it turned out, a price on every head before any of them would be let go. Wesley counted the captives through the gloom without quite meaning to. A peddler still gripping an empty sample case, 2 young cowhands from a ranch north of the valley, an older woman from the stage line who could not stop trembling. 14 people in all by his later count, none of them able to do more than wait and hope the next hour did not go badly for them. The gang's leader was a lean, sun-cured man named Silas Dutcher, well known by reputation, if not by face, a man who had built a small, ugly empire out of exactly this kind of arithmetic. Fear was cheap to produce and expensive to buy your way out of, and Dutcher had learned to price it precisely, down to the dollar, for every kind of traveler this stretch of territory sent his way. The county sheriff, Wesley knew, was 3 full days' ride south chasing a different piece of trouble entirely, And the deputy left behind in Piñon Wells was young, green, and plainly no match for 7 armed men holding hostages behind a locked door. Among the prisoners lined against the warehouse's back wall, hands bound in front of her with plain cord, stood a young Apache woman who held herself so still that Wesley noticed her before he noticed almost anyone else in that crowded, frightened room. She did not weep. She did not strain against the rope the way 2 of the other captives were doing, rubbing their wrists raw against cord that would not give. She stood with her chin level and her dark eyes moving steadily over every man who came near her, cataloging exits and distances the way a person does who has already decided that fear is a luxury she cannot afford to spend right now. Beneath the dust of 2 hard days' travel, she still wore a doe-skin dress worked with fine, careful beadwork along the yoke. The kind of deliberate craft Wesley would come to understand much later, that a Chiricahua woman did not simply throw on for a journey, and that made plain to him before she had spoken a single word, that whoever she was, she came from people who valued her greatly. Her name, Wesley would learn only hours later, was Nayeli, and she had been swept up 2 days before, along with 3 others from a wagon train bound for the mining camps, taken not for ransom money her own family could pay. Dutcher's men hadn't yet worked out who she belonged to, but simply because a lone Apache woman traveling among strangers was, to men like that, an easy thing to grab and a hard thing for anyone in a frightened border town to argue for. Wesley did not carry the kind of money that could buy 14 lives out of a warehouse, and he understood well enough that going for his own gun would get several of those hostages killed before he ever cleared leather. So he did the only thing that gave anyone in that room better odds. He walked in slow, hands loose and open at his sides, and let Dutcher believe he had come to talk terms on behalf of the town, a claim that was, technically, a lie, since nobody had sent him, but a lie that bought time, which was the only currency Wesley actually had that afternoon. He kept his tone unhurried, almost bored, the way a man might talk down a spooked bull rather than a stranger with a pistol on his hip, trading slow, careful words about payment schedules, and good faith he was inventing as he went, and watching Dutcher's face for the exact moment his patience might start to fray. While he held Dutcher's attention, he had already sent a stable boy from the livery slipping out the back alley on the fastest horse in Piñon Wells, riding hard for the county line, where Wesley knew a federal marshals patrol had been working that same week on an entirely different matter. It was a long, ugly stretch of afternoon. Dutcher was no fool, and twice he came close to deciding Wesley was stalling for exactly the reason Wesley was stalling, his hand drifting to the pistol at his hip, while Wesley kept his own voice level and his own hands still, discussing bank drafts and collateral with a calm he did not remotely feel. Twice Dutcher sent one of his men circling behind Wesley to check for a hidden second gun, and twice came away with nothing, since Wesley had left his rifle strapped to his saddle outside on purpose, understanding well that an unarmed man asking questions read as far less of a threat than an armed one did. Nayeli watched him through most of it with an expression he could not quite place, not hope, not yet, but a kind of careful, unblinking attention, as though she were the only other person in that room who understood exactly what he was doing and exactly how thin the ice under it ran. Once, when Dutcher turned away to bark an order at one of his men, Wesley caught her eye for less than a second, and something passed between them that wasn't quite a promise, because he had none to give her yet, but wasn't nothing either. The marshal's patrol reached Piñon Wells a little before sundown, 6 riders coming in fast enough to raise dust visible from the warehouse doors, and Dutcher's negotiating patience ran out the same moment his exit did. There was a short, hard scramble, shouting, one shot fired wide into the warehouse rafters that brought plaster dust down on everyone's heads. 2 of Dutcher's men bolting for the back door only to find deputies already posted there. And inside of 20 minutes, it was over. Every one of Dutcher's gang in irons and every hostage cut loose, blinking in the low orange light like people stepping out of a long tunnel. Wesley had a shallow cut along one forearm from where a knife had been drawn on him in the scramble, and he barely noticed it. He was watching Nayeli, still standing exactly where she'd stood all afternoon, working her raw wrists free of the last of the cord herself, before anyone could reach her to help. He approached her only after the marshal's men had the warehouse fully clear, and he did it the way a person approaches a wounded, wary animal they genuinely respect. Slow, no sudden reach, hands visible the whole way across the room. He had already asked a woman at the mercantile for a blanket and a full canteen, and he held both out to Nayeli at arm's length rather than draping the blanket over her shoulders himself, leaving the choice entirely hers to make. "You don't owe me a word for any of this," Wesley began, the first sentence spoken directly to her all day. "You're free to walk out of this town right now if that's what you want. I only wanted you to have water first." Nayeli studied him for a long moment before her bound hands finally closed around the canteen, her fingers steady despite everything her body had just endured. And when she finally ventured a reply, her English careful, clearly learned somewhere far from this desert, and edged with a wariness Wesley thought she had more than earned. The first thing out of her mouth was not gratitude, but a plain, level question about how many of the other captives would be freed alongside her. The trouble, once the gratitude of the freed hostages and the noise of the marshal's men had died down, was that Nayeli had nowhere obvious to go. She had been traveling with distant kin toward the mining camps when Dutcher's men took her, separated in the raid from the small group she had been with, and she had no way yet of knowing whether any of her own family, a Chiricahua band that moved seasonally between the lower foothills and the higher country, 2 hard days' ride from Piñon Wells, even knew she had been taken, let alone where to start searching for her. She had a shallow gash along one hip from being dragged toward the wagon during the original raid, half-healed and reopened twice since, and the deputy's tiny jail-adjacent office had nothing resembling a proper bed for a woman who badly needed one. Piñon Wells, for all its bustle that afternoon, was not a town especially inclined to open its doors to an injured Apache traveler, with no kin present to vouch for her, and more than one shopkeeper had already found a reason to be busy elsewhere rather than meet her eyes. Wesley watched that particular fact settle over her face as plainly as he had watched her calculate the warehouse exits that morning, and it decided something for him before he had fully worked out the decision in his own head. He made the offer standing right there on the street, plainly, without dressing it up as anything more than what it was. His ranch had a spare room that had belonged to his mother before she passed, a roof, food, and a locked door Nayeli herself could hold the only key to if that was what it took for her to sleep easy. She could stay until her hip healed, and she had the strength for hard travel, and not one day longer than she wanted, and if at any point she decided she would rather take her chances elsewhere. He would saddle a horse and pack it with supplies himself, and raise no argument about where she headed next. He kept his tone as flat and unremarkable as he could manage, the way a man might lay out the terms of a fair cattle trade, because he understood, without anyone needing to explain it to him, that the last thing a woman who had just spent 2 days as a bound captive required was another man deciding things on her behalf, however kindly meant. Nayeli did not answer him right away. She looked at the town around her, at the handful of curious faces still watching from doorways, at the long, empty road east that led toward country she did not yet know how to reach on foot with a bad hip. And she weighed the offer the way Wesley would come to learn she weighed everything, carefully, without hurry, and without the slightest interest in what anyone standing around them thought she ought to decide. "I will come," Nayeli finally decided aloud, "because you have asked nothing of me in return. Not because I need saving." Wesley only nodded, as if that were exactly the answer he had expected and exactly the right one, and went to fetch the wagon rather than lift her onto a horse himself without her leave. The ride out to Cottonwood Valley took the better part of 2 hours, mostly quiet, the kind of quiet Wesley had learned not to fill with unnecessary talk. Nayeli watched the country roll past with the same careful attention she had given the warehouse, noting the shape of the hills, the position of the creek that cut along the western edge of his land, the small cluster of outbuildings that came into view as they crested the last rise before the ranch house itself. It was, Wesley understood instinctively, exactly the kind of attention a person pays to unfamiliar ground when they want to be able to leave it again on their own terms. And he did nothing whatsoever to discourage it, pointing out landmarks without being prompted so that the country might feel a little less foreign to her by the time they arrived. He showed her the spare room, handed over the key without ceremony, and left a plate of food and a fresh basin of water outside her door that first night, rather than intrude on whatever rest she needed. And it was 2 full days before she came out of that room for longer than it took to eat. The healing, when it started in earnest, was slow and mostly silent. Wesley's only hired hand, a leathery old widower named Jubal, who had worked the place since before Wesley's father died, took one look at their new house guest and let the matter rest entirely without comment. A restraint Wesley appreciated more than he ever put into words. Nayeli kept mostly to herself that first week, testing her hips' strength on short walks around the yard when she believed no one was watching, refusing more help than the absolute minimum required, and eating alone on the porch steps rather than at the small kitchen table, as though putting a wall's width of open air between herself and the 2 men living under that roof made the whole arrangement easier to bear. She would not touch the stew Wesley left outside her door the first evening until well after dark, when she must have judged the house quiet enough to risk it, and even then she ate standing at the window rather than seated, watching the yard the way a person watches ground they have not yet decided is safe. Wesley let her have that distance without a word of comment, the same way he had let her keep the only key to her own door, and it was that patience, more than anything spoken aloud in those first days, that seemed to slowly loosen something in her. By the second week, she had stopped eating on the porch steps. By the third, she was in the barn most mornings, before Wesley even got out there himself, and it became plain fast that whatever quiet grief or fear had kept her folded small that first week, it had nothing to do with a lack of skill or nerve. She had a gift with horses that put Wesley's own to shame, a spooked gelding that had thrown 2 riders that spring stood calm as a church pew under her hands within a week, ears forward and head lowered, the way it never once managed for Wesley himself. And she took over the vegetable garden behind the house with an efficiency that embarrassed him a little, thinning and staking and watering on a schedule far better kept than anything he had managed alone. She mended a cracked wagon axle one afternoon, using a method Wesley had never seen. Learned, she explained without much elaboration, from watching her uncle work leather and wood her whole childhood, splitting and binding the wood in a way that outlasted anything the Piñon Wells wheelwright could have charged him for. By the fourth week, Jubal had started bringing his own small mechanical troubles to her instead of Wesley, a shift in loyalty Wesley found more amusing than he let on. And by the fifth week, even the ranch's two half-wild barn cats had taken to following her from chore to chore, which Jubal maintained with the flat certainty of a man who trusted animals more than most people, was proof enough of anything anyone needed to know about her character. Their conversations, when they came, grew slowly out of that shared work rather than out of any deliberate effort on either side to fill the silence. Fixing fence line together one afternoon in the fourth week, Nayeli finally shared, unprompted, a little about the band she had been separated from. A Chiricahua Apache community that moved between the foothills and the higher country depending on season, led in matters that required it by an uncle she plainly respected without idolizing, a grandmother whose stories she still carried whole in her memory, though the old woman had passed 2 winters back. She described a childhood spent learning the names of plants that healed and plants that did not, learning to read weather in the shape of clouds over the peaks long before a person could feel the rain coming, learning the particular patience it took to work beadwork fine enough to last a lifetime of wear. She spoke of her people the way Wesley thought about the land his own father had left him, not as a wound she needed him to acknowledge, but as the plain, solid fact of who she was. And Wesley found he had more genuine curiosity about it than he had expected, and he pressed for detail carefully, the way a man does about something he actually wants to understand rather than merely tolerate. He shared his own father's story in turn, the fall that had ended him and the 6 years since spent proving to nobody in particular that the ranch could survive without him, and Nayeli, listening, pointed out something Jubal had never once put into words in all those years working alongside him, that a man could keep a ranch standing forever and still be lonelier than the coyotes that howled at it every night, and that surviving a thing was not the same as living past it. Wesley did not have an answer for that right away. He turned it over for the better part of a week the way he might turn over a fence post to check it for rot, and eventually decided she was right. A thing he did not admit to many people easily, but confided to her plainly. One evening on the porch steps, she no longer bothered eating alone on. If stories like this one keep you watching past midnight, consider becoming a channel member. Tap join beside the channel name to help keep them coming. What grew between them over those weeks was never rushed on either side, and Wesley made a point, more than once, of reminding her plainly that his door had never once been locked from his side, that she was free to ride for her people the moment she felt strong enough, and that nothing about the roof over her head or the food on his table came with strings attached to it. He meant it every single time he raised the subject, and it was precisely because he meant it. Nayeli would confide much later that she never once felt the need to test it. By the 6th week, her hip had healed clean, her strength was fully back, and one warm morning she found him at the corral and let him know, simply and without ceremony, that she was ready to go find her family. Wesley did not argue, and he did not press her to stay a week longer than she needed to, though it cost him something to keep his voice as even as he managed. He packed her a strong young mare with supplies enough for a hard week's travel, dried meat, a good blanket, a second canteen, more than she had asked for and exactly as much as he could spare without leaving his own place short, and he wanted nothing in return, not a promise to write, not a promise to come back, nothing but her safe travel. "Go find your people," Wesley managed at the gate, his voice rougher than he intended, "and don't feel one thing owed to me for any of it." Nayeli looked at him a long moment, offering no reply at all, and then reached out and pressed her palm briefly against his before she swung up onto the mare and rode east without looking back. Wesley stood at that gate until she had shrunk to a speck on the horizon, and then a while longer after that, believing, as honestly as a man can believe anything, that he had likely seen the last of her. The months that followed settled back into the ordinary rhythm of ranch work, though Wesley noticed, without much wanting to examine it too closely, that the place felt quieter than it had before, not louder in her absence exactly, but somehow more hollow. The way a room feels different once a person knows what it sounds like with another voice in it. He threw himself into the summer roundup, into fence repair, and a new well Jubal had been after him to dig for 2 years. And if his mind drifted more than once toward a stretch of foothill country 2 days east, where he had no real business thinking about, he kept that mostly to himself, working it out of his system with longer days and shorter nights the way he had once worked through his father's death. He rode into Piñon Wells for supplies twice that summer and found himself both times lingering a beat too long near the stage road east before turning his horse back toward home, a habit he did not examine too closely either. Cottonwood Valley, meanwhile, had begun to draw a different kind of trouble that summer, the kind that had nothing to do with warehouses or ransom money and everything to do with plain, ugly greed. A new outlaw gang had been working its way through the county since midsummer, led by a hard, restless man named Ezra Rourke, a former cattle buyer turned rustler who had learned in his years buying stock legitimately exactly which ranches kept thin herds and thinner defenses. Unlike Dutcher's crew, which had wanted money above all else and was willing to let its captives go the moment payment cleared, Rourke's outfit wanted the land itself, good grazing water, cattle that could rustle and drive across the territory line before any brand inspector could catch up to them, and ranches too small or too isolated to defend themselves against a dozen armed riders coming in the dark. They had already burned 2 homesteads to the south that summer and run off enough stock from 3 others to ruin a family that had worked that ground for a decade, leaving behind little more than scorched fence posts and a debt no insurance in that territory would ever cover. The county sheriff, stretched thin across too many miles with too few deputies to spare, had made it plain in a letter posted at the Piñon Wells Mercantile that Cottonwood Valley's ranchers ought to look to their own defense until proper help could be spared, and Wesley read that letter twice at the mercantile counter and did not much care for what he read between its lines. It was a warm evening in early autumn, nearly 5 months after Nayeli had ridden east through his gate, when Wesley heard riders coming up the valley road at a pace that made clear, before he even reached the yard, that something was wrong. He came out onto the porch with his rifle already in hand and found himself looking, in the fading light, at a small party of a dozen Apache riders reining up in his yard, and at their front, sitting a horse with the same level, unhurried composure she had carried through a warehouse full of armed outlaws 5 months earlier, was Nayeli. She was leaner than he remembered, harder in the shoulders from a summer of real work, her hair longer and bound back the way she wore it for hard travel, and the look on her face when she swung down and crossed the yard toward him was not the look of someone who had ridden 2 days for old time's sake. "Rourke's men are 2 days behind us," Nayeli got out, before he had even finished forming the question of what had brought her back. "They hit a Chiricahua camp south of here 8 days ago, looking for horses to steal, and found more resistance than they wanted. And now they mean to take it out on every ranch and camp between there and the territory line before winter closes the passes. Yours included, we believe, within the week." She had come, she made clear, not because she owed him anything, and she was careful, even in the urgency of the moment, to keep that distinction plain, but because her uncle's band had already decided that a threat this size to Cottonwood Valley was a threat to everyone living in it, Apache and rancher both, and she herself had requested to be the one who rode ahead to carry the warning. Wesley wasted no time arguing about the reasoning behind her decision and instead put his energy into what needed doing. And within the hour, he and Jubal had ridden the length of the valley, rousing every rancher within reach. The Hendersons, the Averys, Old Man Whitcomb, who had fought Comanche raiders as a younger man and still kept a rifle oiled by his door, and half a dozen smaller outfits besides. Meanwhile, Nayeli's uncle, a broad, quiet-spoken man whose authority in that camp needed no raised voice to enforce it, laid out with Nayeli translating exactly where and how Rourke's men had struck the ranches to the south, describing the pattern of their raids with the same careful attention Nayeli herself had once given the shape of Cottonwood Valley from the back of a supply wagon. It was not, by any measure, a comfortable gathering for men who had spent their whole lives hearing one set of stories about Apache raiders, and were now, in a single evening, taking tactical counsel from a dozen of them in a Cottonwood Valley ranch yard, passing coffee and hardtack around the same fire while the plan took shape. But the alternative, every rancher there understood plainly enough, was to lose everything they had built to Rourke's gang inside of a week, and discomfort lost that argument quickly against a threat that size. They spent the better part of 2 days preparing, ranchers and Chiricahua riders working the same fence lines and the same narrow defile where the valley road pinched between two rock shoulders, the only sensible route a dozen mounted raiders could take without losing half their horses on the broken ground to either side. Nayeli's uncle knew that ground the way Wesley knew his own fields, having hunted it as a younger man long before the treaties and the reservation lines had rearranged where his people were permitted to travel, and it was his plan, more than anyone else's, that shaped where the ranchers dug in below and where the Chiricahua riders would hold position along the higher rocks, out of easy rifle range until the moment came to close it. Wesley found himself, more than once during those 2 days, simply watching how naturally the two groups fell into a shared rhythm, despite a lifetime of mutual suspicion on both sides. Old Man Whitcomb trading tobacco with one of Nayeli's younger cousins by the second afternoon as though they had known each other for years. The Henderson boys learning, a little sheepishly, that several of the Chiricahua riders spoke better English than they let on, and simply preferred not to waste words on strangers. A rider was sent hard for the county line to bring back whatever lawmen could be spared, though nobody in that valley expected help to arrive before Rourke's gang did, and by the second evening, every man and woman with a rifle and steady hands had a place assigned and understood exactly what was coming. Wesley found Nayeli checking the girth on her horse in the last gray light before full dark fell, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The whole strange distance and closeness of the last 5 months sitting quietly between them. "You didn't have to come back for this," he managed finally. She looked at him with something that was not quite a smile, though it came close. I know, Nayeli agreed, which is exactly why I did. It was the first exchange between them all evening that had nothing to do with rifles or rock positions, and it stayed with Wesley through the long, cold, watchful hours that followed. A small, warm thing to hold on to against the darker possibilities the night still carried. Rourke's gang came up the valley road 2 hours before dawn, the way raiders always preferred, banking on darkness and surprise. 15 riders moving fast and loud with torches meant to spread fire through the first ranch house they reached, and rode instead into a defile lined on both sides with men and women who had spent 2 full days making sure of exactly this outcome. The fight that followed was short, brutal, and entirely unlike anything either the ranchers or Rourke's men had expected walking into it. Chiricahua riders opened from the high rocks first, driving the lead riders back into a narrowing column, just as Wesley, Jubal, and Old Man Whitcomb opened up from the fence line below, muzzle flashes lighting the dark in short, ragged bursts. And within minutes, Rourke's advantage of surprise had collapsed entirely into a trap sprung from both sides at once. The raiders' own torches now doing nothing but lighting them up as targets against the pale rock. Wesley kept low behind the fence post he had chosen the day before, working the lever of his rifle with hands that had gone strangely steady the moment the shooting started, more steady than they had ever been trading empty words with Silas Dutcher a year and a half earlier. Somewhere above him on the rocks he could hear Nayeli's uncle calling short, clipped instructions that needed no translation for anyone who had spent the last 2 days learning the plan. And twice he caught sight of Nayeli herself among the riders on the higher ground, controlling a spooked horse with the same easy hands she had once used to gentle a gelding in his own barn. Rourke himself tried twice to break his men free toward open country, and twice found the trails he needed already covered, once by 2 of Nayeli's cousins holding a narrow gap with a discipline that would have done any cavalry unit proud, and once by Wesley himself, who put a bullet through Rourke's shoulder at close range when the man tried to ride straight over him rather than surrender, the impact spinning Rourke half out of his saddle and ending, for all practical purposes, whatever fight remained in the rest of his gang. By the time gray dawn broke fully over the valley, 6 of Rourke's gang lay dead or badly wounded, the rest disarmed and bound with the same plain cord Dutcher's men had once used on Nayeli herself, an irony more than one rancher remarked on quietly once the shooting had stopped and the shaking in her hands had begun to ease. The county deputies who finally arrived an hour later, having ridden through most of the night once the warning reached them, found very little left to do beyond loading prisoners into a wagon and taking down names for the circuit judge. Not one rancher and not one Chiricahua rider had been killed that morning, though Jubal carried a graze along his ribs for a month afterward that he wore around town like a badge of honor, and Old Man Whitcomb's hat came home with a bullet hole through the crown that he never once got around to mending, on the theory that a hole like that was worth more as a story than the hat had ever been worth as a hat. The town of Piñon Wells, when word of it spread over the following days, did not quite know what to make of the story. A valley's worth of ranchers and a Chiricahua Apache band standing shoulder to shoulder against a common enemy, planning together, fighting together, and walking away from it having lost no one at all. There were a few sour, grumbling remarks from men who would rather have kept their old suspicions intact, the kind who found something new to distrust about the arrangement, no matter how plainly it had worked. But there were more, Wesley noticed, who simply stopped by the mercantile counter to mention they had heard what happened out at Cottonwood Valley and thought it was about time somebody proved the old fears wrong. Old man Whitcomb, of all people, took to informing anyone within earshot that he had fought beside better soldiers in that valley than he ever had in uniform, and meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to pay. Even the young deputy who had once looked so overmatched inside Dutcher's warehouse rode out personally to shake Nayeli's uncle's hand, an act small enough in itself but large enough, in a town like Piñon Wells, to be noticed and talked about for weeks. Nayeli's people stayed in the valley for several weeks after the fighting ended, helping the Hendersons and 2 other families rebuild fence and outbuildings damaged in Rourke's earlier raids, hauling lumber and resetting posts alongside ranch hands who, a season earlier, would have crossed the street to avoid them. Something in the county's easy old prejudices seemed to loosen a little more with every day that passed, with Chiricahua riders and ranch families working the same ground without incident, sharing the same well water, trading the same stories over the same fires at the end of a long day's labor. Nayeli herself stayed at Wesley's ranch through most of it, back in the same spare room with the same key she still kept, though she spent fewer and fewer of her evenings behind that locked door, and more of them out on the porch steps with him, watching the light go gold and then gray over the western ridge, the way it had the very first week she had come to stay there, a full year and a lifetime of difference behind her now. Those evenings were never rushed, and neither of them tried to make them into something they were not yet ready for. They talked about small things mostly, a new foal born that week, a story her grandmother used to tell about the first horses, a piece of harness that needed mending before winter, the particular way the cottonwoods along the creek turned color earlier than any other tree in the valley. And it was in those small, unhurried conversations, more than in anything either of them announced out loud, that whatever had been growing quietly between them since that first week finally found room to breathe properly. Some evenings Nayeli taught him a handful of words from her own language, laughing softly without unkindness at how badly his tongue managed the sounds. And some evenings Wesley found himself simply watching the way firelight moved across her face while she worked a piece of beadwork in her lap, in no particular hurry to say anything at all. Wesley never once tried to hurry her, the same way he had never once tried to keep her, and Nayeli, watching him hold that same careful patience through 5 months and a small war and everything that followed after, began to understand that the things she felt for him had very little to do with the day he had walked into a warehouse to buy her freedom, and a great deal to do with every ordinary day since. If you've made it this far into a story like theirs, that's exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for, and becoming a member is a simple way to back more of them. Just tap join near the channel name whenever you're ready. By the time the last of the fence repairs were finished and Nayeli's people prepared to move back toward their winter camp in the foothills, Wesley had made up his mind about something he'd been turning over since roughly the second week she'd stayed under his roof, though it had taken him the better part of a year to trust that he understood it correctly. He did not ask her outright before she left that time, sensing correctly that whatever he had to say deserved more ceremony than a hurried word at the gate, and so he let her ride out with her people with nothing between them but a long look and a promise, unspoken but plain enough, that this would not be the last either of them saw of the other. Nearly a year to the week after he had first walked into that warehouse in Piñon Wells, Wesley rode east into the foothills with nothing but a good horse, a small hand-forged ring the blacksmith in town had made him to his own careful specifications, and a nervousness he had not felt since he was a much younger man. He found the winter camp without much trouble. Nayeli had drawn him a rough map of the country the year before, half in jest, and it turned out to be accurate down to the last creek crossing. And he presented himself to her uncle first, as he understood was proper, requesting permission to speak plainly in front of the whole gathered community, rather than drawing Nayeli aside to say his piece where no one else could hold him to it. Her uncle studied him for a long, unhurried moment in the way Wesley remembered from that night above the valley defile, then simply gestured him toward the fire at the center of camp, where the whole community had already begun to gather, drawn by little more than the sight of a lone rancher riding in with obvious purpose. Standing before her family in the wider camp, with Nayeli herself watching him with an expression he could not fully read, Wesley laid out the thing he had come to say, without much dressing it up, that he did not come asking her to leave who she was or where she came from behind, that whatever life they built together would need to hold room for both the ranch in Cottonwood Valley and the people she loved in these foothills, and that he was asking her, respectfully and with her family as witness, whether she would choose to build that life at his side. He held out the ring not as a bargain but as a plain token of intent, small and unpolished and entirely honest. And then he simply waited, hat in his hands, for whatever answer she gave him. The whole camp gone quiet enough that the fire's crackle was the loudest sound in the clearing. Nayeli did not answer right away, and when she finally did, she raised her voice loud enough for her whole community to hear it as well as him. "I do not love you because you freed me from that warehouse," Nayeli began. "I loved you long after that debt was already settled, because you never once tried to collect on it, because from that first day you handed me a key to my own door and meant it every single time you promised I was free to use it." She took the ring, and her uncle, watching the whole exchange with the same quiet, unshowy authority he had brought to a rock ledge above a valley defile a year earlier, gave his blessing without needing to be asked a second time, while the rest of the gathered camp broke into the kind of easy, relieved laughter that follows a held breath, finally let go. The wedding itself, held the following spring once the passes had cleared and the whole valley could travel easily, brought together a stretch of country that had spent a generation mostly keeping to its separate corners. It was held out in the open, at Wesley's own request, on the rise above Cottonwood Valley, where his mother had once wanted the house built for the morning light, and Nayeli's uncle blessed the union in the manner of her own people, before the circuit preacher from Piñon Wells said a shorter word or two of his own, neither ceremony crowding out the other. Ranchers from as far south as the Henderson place stood alongside Chiricahua families who had traveled 2 full days to attend. The sheriff himself rode up from the county seat to stand as a witness, and Old Man Whitcomb, true to form, informed anyone within earshot that he had never in his life expected to dance at a wedding quite like this one, and would not have missed it for the world. There was food enough for the whole valley twice over, laid out on plank tables between the ranch house and the corral, and music that borrowed a little from every tradition present that day. Drums and fiddles trading turns around the same fire until well past dark. By the time the dancing finally wound down, there was not one soul left in attendance who could have said, with any real conviction, exactly which side of the valley's old dividing lines they had once stood on. Wesley Calder had ridden into a warehouse a year and a half earlier, expecting nothing more than to buy some desperate people a little time, and he had found instead, standing bound and unbroken among Silas Dutcher's captives, the one person who would go on to teach him that real courage rarely announces itself, and that the kindest thing one person can offer another is not rescue but respect, freely given and never held over anyone's head as a debt owed. Nayeli, for her part, had lost nearly everything the day Dutcher's men dragged her from the road, and had found in the unlikeliest of places a man patient enough to hand it all back to her one quiet, unhurried day at a time, wanting nothing in return but the chance, eventually, to build something new alongside her. She had come to his ranch a stranger with a locked door and a key she trusted no one else to hold, and she left it a year and a half later, a wife who had chosen every part of the life she was stepping into. Cottonwood Valley never did go back entirely to its old separate corners after that spring, and neither, in the best possible way, did the two of them.